The current was stronger than anything Lorraine Summers had ever felt, dragging her under for the third time as her fingers clawed desperately at the waterlogged piece of driftwood that had become her only lifeline in the churning brown waters of the Missouri River. She had been crossing on the ferry with her family's wagon train when the rope snapped and chaos erupted, sending her tumbling into the merciless current that pulled her away from everything she knew. And now her arms burned with exhaustion as she fought to keep her head above water, her heavy skirts dragging her down like anchors determined to claim her life on this scorching June day in 1875. Isaac Reynolds heard the screams from where he was watering his horse along the riverbank, and his head snapped up to see the flash of blue fabric and pale arms wrapped around a piece of wood being swept downstream at a frightening pace. Without thinking, he spurred his black stallion into the water, driving the powerful animal deeper until the current caught them both. But he was ready for it, leaning low over the horse's neck and urging him forward with commands and pressure from his knees. The woman's face was pale with terror, her dark hair plastered to her cheeks, and he could see her strength failing as her grip on the driftwood began to slip. "Hold on," he shouted over the roar of the water, pushing his horse harder, angling to intercept her before the current swept her into the rapids downstream where the rocks would tear her apart. His arms stretched out, muscles straining as he leaned dangerously far from the saddle, and his fingers caught the fabric of her dress just as her hands lost their grip on the wood. With strength born of years working cattle and breaking horses, he hauled her up and across his lap, her body limp and trembling as she coughed up river water all over his shirt. "I have you. You are safe now," he said, his voice rough but gentle as he turned his horse back toward the shore, feeling her shaking against him as she struggled to breathe. The stallion lunged up the muddy bank, hooves finding purchase in the soft earth, and Isaac didn't stop until they were well away from the water's edge. He dismounted in one smooth motion, then reached up to lift her down, surprised by how light she felt despite her waterlogged clothing. Her legs buckled the moment her feet touched ground, and he caught her, lowering them both to sit in the tall grass while she coughed and gasped. Lorraine couldn't stop shaking, her whole body trembling from cold and shock, despite the summer heat beating down on them. She was aware of strong arms around her, of a solid chest supporting her back, of a deep voice murmuring reassurances while she struggled to fill her lungs with air instead of river water. When she could finally focus her eyes, she found herself looking up into the most striking face she had ever seen, all hard angles and sun-bronzed skin, with eyes the color of whiskey that watched her with genuine concern. "My family," she managed to choke out, panic rising fresh in her chest. "The wagon train they were crossing, I fell. They do not know where I am." "Where were you crossing?" he asked, his hands steady on her shoulders as he looked into her face, making sure she was truly coherent. "About 2 miles upstream, near the ferry crossing at Nebraska City," she said, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, mixing with the river water already there. "They will think I drowned." Isaac nodded, understanding the urgency, but also knowing she needed a few more minutes before she could handle being on horseback again. "We will get you back to them, I promise you that. But first you need to catch your breath properly. You are safe now, and we will make sure your family knows it too." She nodded, trying to calm the frantic beating of her heart, and as the immediate terror began to fade, she became acutely aware of the intimacy of their position, sitting in his lap essentially, his arms still around her. Heat that had nothing to do with the sun flooded her cheeks, and she tried to pull away, but her body was not cooperating, muscles turned to water. "Easy now," he said softly, and there was something in his voice that made her stop struggling. "You almost died just now. Give yourself a minute." "I am being improper," she whispered, but she did not have the strength to move. "You are being alive," he corrected, and there was a hint of something that might have been humor in his tone. "That is all that matters right now." They sat there for several minutes, her breathing gradually evening out, and Lorraine found herself studying him in quick glances. He was younger than she had first thought, probably only a few years older than her own 21 years, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, and the kind of build that came from hard physical labor. His hands, still resting lightly on her arms, were calloused and strong, with scars across the knuckles that spoke of a life that was not always easy or safe. "What is your name?" she asked finally, her voice still hoarse from the river water. "Isaac Reynolds," he answered, and she saw the corner of his mouth quirk up slightly. "I have a ranch about 5 miles from here. I was checking on some strays when I heard the commotion." "Lorraine Summers," she replied, and then added, "Thank you for saving my life. I would have drowned if you had not come." "I am just glad I was close enough to reach you," he said, and the sincerity in his voice made something flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with her near-death experience. "Are you able to ride now? We should get you back to your family before they organize search parties." She nodded, though she was not entirely sure her legs would support her. Isaac stood first, then reached down to help her up, and she was mortified to find that she could barely stand without swaying. He caught her immediately, one arm going around her waist to steady her. "The current took more out of you than you realize," he said. "You are going to have to ride with me. Can you manage that?" The thought of spending more time pressed against him should have scandalized her, but Lorraine found she did not care about propriety nearly as much as she cared about getting back to her parents and her younger brother before they lost their minds with grief. "Yes," she said simply. Isaac lifted her onto his horse as easily as if she weighed nothing, then swung up behind her, one arm secure around her waist as he gathered the reins. She could feel the solid warmth of him at her back, could smell leather and sage and something that was purely him. And despite everything she had just been through, she felt safer than she had in months of traveling the dangerous trails west. They rode upstream along the river's edge, Isaac keeping the pace steady but not too fast, mindful of her ordeal. Lorraine watched the water sliding past, dark and deceptive, and shuddered to think how close she had come to disappearing beneath its surface forever. The arm around her waist tightened slightly, a silent comfort, and she found herself leaning back against him without consciously deciding to do so. "Have you come far?" Isaac asked after a while, his voice close to her ear, and she had to suppress another shiver that had nothing to do with being cold. "From Pennsylvania," she answered. "We have been traveling for 2 months now. My father heard there was good land to be claimed in Oregon, fertile soil and plenty of water. He sold everything we had to make this journey." "That is a long way to come on faith and rumors," Isaac observed, but there was no judgment in his tone, only understanding. "My father is a farmer, and the land back east was wearing out, getting too crowded. He wanted something better for us, a fresh start where we could build something that would last." She paused, then added quietly, "Though I suppose none of that matters if I had drowned in the Missouri River." "But you did not drown," Isaac said firmly. "You are alive, and you will make it to Oregon with your family, and you will have that fresh start your father dreamed of." His certainty was comforting, and Lorraine found herself wanting to believe him, wanting to trust in the steady confidence she could hear in his voice. They rode in companionable silence for a while, and she became aware of the landscape around them, the rolling prairie grassland stretching away from the river, the endless sky overhead, the heat that made the air shimmer in the distance. It was so different from the green hills and forests of Pennsylvania, so vast and open it made her feel both small and strangely free at the same time. "There," Isaac said suddenly, pointing ahead to where she could see the ferry crossing and the cluster of wagons pulled up on the shore. Even from a distance, she could see people moving around frantically, and her heart clenched with guilt at the worry she must have caused. "That is your wagon train." "Yes," she confirmed, recognizing the distinctive canvas covers and the arrangement of the wagons. "The one with the blue paint on the side panel is my family's." Isaac urged his horse into a faster trot, and as they approached, someone shouted and pointed in their direction. People began running toward them, and Lorraine saw her mother push through the crowd, her face streaked with tears. The moment Isaac brought his horse to a stop, Lorraine was sliding down, caught by her father's strong hands, and then she was engulfed in her mother's embrace, both of them crying and talking at once. "We thought you were dead," her mother sobbed, holding her so tightly Lorraine could barely breathe. "We searched the water, we were preparing to." She could not finish the sentence, breaking down into fresh tears. "I am alive, Mother, I am here," Lorraine assured her, her own tears flowing freely now. Over her mother's shoulder, she could see her younger brother Daniel standing there with red-rimmed eyes, looking both relieved and shaken. He was only 15, and the thought that he had believed her dead was almost more than she could bear. Her father, a solid man with graying hair and a weathered face, turned to Isaac, who had dismounted and stood holding his horse's reins a respectful distance away. "You saved my daughter's life," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I do not know how to thank you for that." "No thanks necessary," Isaac replied, but Lorraine's father was already shaking his head. "There is every reason for thanks," he insisted. "You risked your own life going into that current. Many men would not have done that for a stranger." He paused, seeming to struggle with his words, then said, "I am Thomas Summers. This is my wife Margaret, my son Daniel, and you have already met my daughter Lorraine." "Isaac Reynolds," he said again, nodding respectfully to each of them. "I am glad I was nearby when it happened." The wagon master, a grizzled man named Callahan who had led trains across the country for 15 years, came forward then. "The ferry rope is repaired now, and we are getting ready to finish the crossing. Will you be joining us, Miss Summers? The doctor from the other wagon should take a look at you after that ordeal." Lorraine nodded, suddenly feeling exhausted beyond measure, and her mother immediately began fussing over her, trying to get her toward their wagon. But Lorraine turned back, looking for Isaac, needing to see him one more time before he rode away from her life forever. He was already mounting his horse, preparing to leave, and something painful twisted in her chest at the sight. "Wait," she called out, pulling free of her mother's grasp and hurrying over to him. He looked down at her, surprise flickering across his features, and she realized she had no idea what she actually wanted to say. "I thank you again. I will never forget what you did for me today." Something shifted in his expression, his eyes softening as he looked at her. "You take care of yourself, Lorraine Summers. The West can be dangerous for those who are not prepared for it." "I will," she promised, and then, because she might never see him again and the words needed to be said, she added, "You are a good man, Isaac Reynolds." She thought she saw color rise in his cheeks, but he tipped his hat to her, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Safe travels to Oregon," he said, and then he was turning his horse, riding away across the prairie, and Lorraine stood watching until he was nothing but a dark speck against the golden grass. The rest of that day passed in a blur of activity. The doctor, a kind older man named Pritchard, examined Lorraine and declared that she was remarkably unharmed considering her ordeal. though he insisted she rest in the wagon for the remainder of the day. The crossing was completed without further incident, though Lorraine noticed her father kept Daniel and her mother away from the edge with extra vigilance. They made camp that evening on the far side of the river, and as Lorraine lay in the wagon listening to the sounds of the camp around her, all she could think about was whiskey-colored eyes and strong arms pulling her from certain death. She told herself she was being foolish, that the intensity of the experience had confused her emotions, that she would forget about Isaac Reynolds by morning. But morning came and she had not forgotten, and the day after that was the same, and the day after that. The wagon train moved steadily west, covering 10 to 15 miles a day when the terrain allowed, and Lorraine settled back into the routine of travel, but something had changed inside her. The world felt different now, colors brighter and sound sharper, and she found herself thinking about the way Isaac had looked at her, the gentleness in his calloused hands, the certainty in his voice when he promised to get her back to her family. It was foolish and pointless, and she knew it, but her heart did not seem to care about logic. They were 3 days past Nebraska City when the first wagon wheel broke, forcing the train to stop for repairs. Lorraine was gathering firewood with 2 other young women from the train when she heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. She looked up, her heart inexplicably jumping in her chest, and saw a lone rider coming across the prairie from the east. Even at a distance, she recognized the black stallion and the way the man sat his saddle, and she dropped the wood she was carrying without thinking, walking toward him as if pulled by an invisible cord. Isaac Reynolds reined in his horse when he saw her, and Lorraine watched 100 different emotions flicker across his face in the space of a heartbeat. He looked uncertain, almost nervous, which seemed completely at odds with the confident man who had pulled her from the river without hesitation. "Hello," she said, because someone had to speak first and he seemed to have been struck temporarily mute. "Hello," he echoed, and then he dismounted in one fluid motion, standing there holding his reins and looking at her like he was not quite sure she was real. How are you feeling?" "After the river, I mean. Are you recovered?" "I am well," Lorraine assured him, unable to stop the smile that spread across her face. "What are you doing here?" He looked down at his boots, and she could swear he was embarrassed, which was somehow endearing on a man who looked like he could handle anything the frontier threw at him. "I told myself I was checking on strays that had wandered too far west," he said finally, looking back up to meet her eyes. "But that was a lie. The truth is I have not been able to stop thinking about you, and I needed to see that you were truly all right." Lorraine's breath caught in her throat, her heart suddenly pounding so hard she was certain he must be able to hear it. "You rode 3 days to check on me." "Seems foolish when I say it out loud," Isaac admitted, a rueful smile tugging at his mouth. "You probably think I am insane." "I think you are the least insane thing I have encountered since we left Pennsylvania," Lorraine said honestly. "I have been thinking about you too, constantly." "I thought I was going mad." The relief that flooded his features was almost comical, and he took a step closer to her, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his eyes, the small scar on his chin that she had not noticed before. "I have no right to ask this," he said, his voice low and urgent. "You have a life planned, a destination, a future in Oregon, but I need to know, is there any chance, any possibility at all that you might consider staying here, in Nebraska?" The question hung between them, enormous and terrifying and exhilarating all at once. Lorraine knew what the sensible answer should be, knew she should thank him kindly and send him away and continue west with her family as planned. But the sensible answer died on her lips, replaced by a truth that felt like it had been growing in her heart since the moment he pulled her onto his horse. "I would need to talk to my parents," she said carefully. They gave up everything to make this journey. I cannot just abandon them without explanation. I understand that, Isaac said quickly. I would never ask you to hurt your family, but if there was a way, if they would understand, would you want to stay? Lorraine looked at him, really looked at him, trying to see past the intensity of the moment to the reality of what he was offering. I barely know you, she pointed out, though her heart was screaming that she knew everything that mattered. Then let me tell you about myself, Isaac said. I am 24 years old. I have a ranch 5 miles east of Nebraska City, 160 acres that I claimed 3 years ago and have been building up ever since. I have a small herd of cattle, about 50 head, and I am adding to it every year. I have a cabin, nothing fancy, but it is solid and weathertight, with 2 rooms and a good fireplace. I have money saved, not a fortune, but enough to prove I can provide. I work hard, I do not drink to excess, and I have never raised my hand to a woman or child in my life. He paused, taking a breath, and when he continued his voice was softer, more vulnerable. I know this is fast, I know it is crazy, but I also know that I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. And I had to at least try, because the thought of never seeing you again was worse than the thought of you rejecting me. Lorraine felt tears prick her eyes, overwhelmed by the raw honesty in his words. I feel the same way, she whispered. It terrifies me how much I feel after knowing you for such a short time. It does not make sense. Then let us give it a chance to make sense, Isaac urged. Let me talk to your father. Let me explain my intentions properly. I am not trying to steal you away in the night. I want to do this right, with your family's blessing if possible. Before Lorraine could respond, she heard her father's voice calling her name. She turned to see him walking toward them, his expression wary as he took in the scene. Daniel was with him, looking curious and protective in equal measure. Lorraine's stomach dropped, knowing how this must appear, but Isaac stepped forward immediately, his posture respectful but confident. Mr. Summers, he said, inclining his head, I apologize for the intrusion. My name is Isaac Reynolds. I am the man who pulled your daughter from the river a few days ago. I remember you, Thomas said, his eyes moving between Isaac and Lorraine, clearly trying to assess the situation. What brings you out here? I came to speak with you, sir, if you would be willing to hear me out, Isaac said. It concerns your daughter. Thomas's expression hardened slightly, and Lorraine saw Daniel tense beside him. Go on, her father said, his tone carefully neutral. Isaac did not flinch from Thomas's scrutiny. I know this will sound presumptuous and hasty, but I would like your permission to court your daughter properly, with the intention of marriage if she will have me. I have a ranch near Nebraska City, a good piece of land with water and grass, and I can provide for her well. I know you have plans to go to Oregon, and I know what I am asking is not small, but I am hoping you might consider allowing Lorraine to stay here with me. The silence that followed was deafening. Lorraine watched her father's face, seeing shock and confusion and the beginning of anger warring there. Daniel looked completely stunned. Thomas opened his mouth, closed it, then finally found his voice. You want me to leave my daughter here in Nebraska with a man we do not know, based on one meeting 3 days ago. His tone made it clear exactly how insane he thought that idea was. I know how it sounds, Isaac said steadily. But I am willing to answer any questions you have, to show you my ranch, to let you investigate my character with anyone in Nebraska City. I am not asking you to hand over your daughter to a stranger on blind faith. I am asking for the opportunity to prove to you that I can make her happy, that I can give her a good life. Father, Lorraine spoke up, her voice shaking slightly. Please listen to him. Thomas turned to look at her, and she saw the hurt in his eyes. "You want this?" he asked. "You want to stay here instead of coming to Oregon with your family?" The pain in his voice nearly broke her heart. "I do not want to leave you," Lorraine said, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You are my family and I love you. But yes, I want to stay. I know it is fast and I know it seems crazy, but I feel something with Isaac that I have never felt before. It feels right, Father. It feels like the fresh start you were searching for, just in a different place than we planned." Thomas looked at his daughter for a long moment, then back at Isaac. "You pulled her from the river," he said slowly. "You saved her life when you could have just ridden on and left her to drown. That speaks to your character, I will give you that, but marriage is not gratitude and infatuation fades." "I agree completely," Isaac said. "Which is why I am not asking to marry her tomorrow. I am asking for the chance to court her properly, to let you get to know me, to prove that this is more than just a fleeting attraction. If you need to see my ranch, to talk to my neighbors, to satisfy yourself that I am who I claim to be, I welcome all of that." Thomas rubbed his face, looking suddenly older and tired. "The wagon train is not stopping," he said. "We have repairs to make today, but we leave tomorrow at dawn. If you want me to consider this, you have until then to convince me." "That is all I ask," Isaac said, inclining his head. "Thank you, sir." What followed was perhaps the strangest and most intense day of Lorraine's life. Isaac rode back to his ranch and returned within a few hours with a neighbor, a respected rancher named Abernathy, who had known Isaac since he first arrived in Nebraska. Abernathy spoke at length about Isaac's character, his work ethic, his honesty in business dealings, and his standing in the community. He also brought a letter from the land office in Nebraska City confirming Isaac's claim and ownership of his property. Thomas questioned Isaac for hours, asking about his background, his plans for the future, his ability to provide, his views on family and faith, and 100 other things. Isaac answered every question with patience and honesty, never getting defensive or irritated even when Thomas's questions became quite pointed. Lorraine watched it all, her heart in her throat, terrified that her father would say no, that she would have to choose between her family and this unexpected chance at happiness. As evening fell and the campfires were lit, Margaret pulled Lorraine aside, away from the men and their serious discussion. They walked a little way from the wagons, and Margaret took her daughter's hands in her own, studying her face in the fading light. "Tell me the truth," Margaret said softly. "Is this really what you want? Or do you feel obligated because he saved your life?" "It is what I want," Lorraine said without hesitation. "I know how it sounds, Mother. I know it is fast and probably seems foolish. But when I am with him, I feel like I am exactly where I am supposed to be. Like everything that happened, the journey west, falling in the river, all of it led to this moment." "Does that sound completely insane?" Margaret smiled, though there were tears in her eyes. "It sounds like how I felt when I met your father," she admitted. "We knew each other only 2 weeks before he proposed, and everyone said we were rushing into disaster. But we have been married 23 years now, and I have never regretted saying yes to him." She paused, brushing Lorraine's hair back from her face in a gesture that was achingly familiar. "I will miss you terribly if you stay here, but I can see in your eyes that you have already made your choice, and I will support you in it." "Thank you, Mother," Lorraine whispered, hugging her tightly. As full dark fell, Thomas finally asked to speak with Isaac privately, and the two men walked away from the camp together. Lorraine waited with Daniel, who had been uncharacteristically quiet through the whole ordeal. He kept looking at her with an expression she could not quite read. "Are you really going to stay?" he asked finally. "If Father gives permission, yes," Lorraine answered. Daniel nodded slowly. "I will miss you. Who will I talk to when Father is being impossible?" Despite the tension of the situation, Lorraine laughed. "You will manage. You are growing up, Daniel. You do not need your older sister to protect you anymore." "Maybe not," Daniel admitted, "but I liked having you around anyway." He paused, then added, "He seems like a good man. Isaac, I mean. If you have to stay behind with someone, at least it is someone who dove into a raging river to save you." When Thomas and Isaac returned, Thomas's expression was unreadable. He stood before the whole family, and Lorraine found herself holding her breath, knowing that the next words out of his mouth would determine the entire course of her future. "Isaac Reynolds has asked for permission to court my daughter with the intention of marriage," Thomas said formally. "He has answered all of my questions to my satisfaction, and his character has been vouched for by respectable men. More importantly, my daughter has made it clear that this is her genuine wish, not something she feels obligated to do." He paused, and Lorraine saw his throat work as he swallowed hard. "Therefore, I am giving my permission for Lorraine to remain here in Nebraska under Isaac's protection and care, with the understanding that they will be properly married within a reasonable time frame." Lorraine let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, and when she looked at Isaac, the relief and joy on his face mirrored exactly what she was feeling. But her father was not done speaking. "However," Thomas continued, his voice stern, "I want your word, Isaac Reynolds, that you will treat my daughter with respect and kindness, that you will provide for her to the best of your ability, and that if she ever needs her family, you will not prevent her from returning to us." "You have my word on all of that," Isaac said solemnly. "And more than that, you have my promise that I will do everything in my power to make her happy for the rest of my life." Thomas nodded, then turned to Lorraine. "Come here, daughter." Lorraine went to him and he pulled her into a tight embrace. "You are sure about this?" he asked quietly one last time. "I am sure," she whispered back. "Then may God bless you and keep you safe," Thomas said, his voice breaking slightly. "You will always be my little girl, no matter how far apart we are." The wagon train left at dawn the next morning as planned. Lorraine stood with Isaac and watched the wagons roll west across the prairie, her mother's handkerchief clutched in her hand, tears streaming down her face as she waved goodbye to the only family she had ever known. Daniel rode at the back of their wagon, waving until he was nothing but a speck in the distance, and Margaret kept turning around to look back, one hand raised in farewell. When the last wagon had disappeared over the horizon, Lorraine felt Isaac's arm come around her shoulders, solid and comforting. "You can change your mind," he said quietly. "I can saddle a horse right now and you can catch up to them within an hour. I will not hold you to anything." Lorraine turned to look up at him, this man who was offering her an escape even though she knew it would devastate him if she took it. "I do not want to change my mind," she said firmly. "I want to see this ranch of yours and start building our life together." The smile that spread across Isaac's face was like the sun coming out from behind clouds, and he took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "Then let us go home," he said. The ride to Isaac's ranch took just over an hour, and Lorraine spent the entire journey taking in the landscape that would be her new home. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, the grass rippling in the wind like waves on a golden ocean. Here and there, she saw clusters of wildflowers, purple and yellow and white, and once they startled a group of antelope that bounded away with incredible grace. The sky overhead was impossibly blue and vast, and she understood for the first time what people meant when they talked about the freedom of the West. Isaac's ranch appeared gradually, first as a dark spot on the horizon, then resolving into a sturdy cabin with a stone chimney and a barn behind it. There was a corral with several horses, a chicken coop, and what looked like a well-maintained vegetable garden. It was not grand or impressive, but it was solid and real, proof of hard work and determination, and Lorraine loved it immediately. "It is not much yet," Isaac said, and she could hear the nervousness in his voice. "But I have plans to expand, to build a bigger house when we can afford it, to increase the herd. I know it probably seems rough compared to what you are used to." "It seems perfect," Lorraine said honestly. "It seems like home." Isaac helped her down from the horse, his hands lingering on her waist for a moment longer than strictly necessary, and Lorraine felt heat rise in her cheeks. There was so much left unsaid between them, so many things they still needed to learn about each other, but the attraction was undeniable, crackling in the air whenever they were close. "Let me show you inside," Isaac said, and there was a roughness to his voice that made her pulse quicken. The cabin was simple but clean, with a main room that served as kitchen and living area, and a separate bedroom partitioned off with a solid door. The furniture was handmade but well crafted, and there were touches that surprised her. A braided rug on the floor, curtains at the windows, a shelf of books on one wall. "You read?" she asked, surprised and pleased. "When I have time," Isaac admitted. "My mother was a school teacher back in Missouri. She made sure I had an education before she passed." There was a story there, one of loss and hardship, and Lorraine filed it away for later when they knew each other well enough for him to share it. For now, she was content to explore her new home, to imagine the life they would build together within these walls. "There is a woman in town, Mrs. Henderson, who has agreed to act as chaperone for you until we can arrange a proper wedding," Isaac said. "I know your father trusts me, but I want to do this right. I will ride into Nebraska City tomorrow and bring her back here, and she can stay in the bedroom while I sleep in the barn." Lorraine turned to look at him, touched by his consideration for her reputation. "When do you want to marry?" she asked. "As soon as possible," Isaac said immediately, then colored. "That is, whenever you are ready. I do not want to rush you. You rode 3 days to ask permission to court me, and we are talking about marriage," Lorraine pointed out with a small smile. "I think we have already established that neither of us is particularly interested in taking things slowly." Isaac laughed, the sound rich and genuine, and crossed the room to stand in front of her. "Then let me ask you properly," he said, and before she realized what he was doing, he had dropped to one knee, taking her hand in his. "Lorraine Summers, I know we have known each other only a few days, and I know there is still so much we need to learn about each other. But I also know that I want to spend the rest of my life learning those things, that I want to wake up every morning with you beside me and fall asleep every night knowing you are safe and happy. Will you marry me?" Lorraine felt tears spring to her eyes for what felt like the 100th time that day, but these were tears of joy, of overwhelming rightness. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain. "Yes, I will marry you, Isaac Reynolds." He stood and pulled her into his arms, and for a moment they just held each other, the reality of what they were promising finally settling in. Then Isaac tilted her face up to his eyes searching hers for permission, and when she gave the smallest nod, he kissed her. It was gentle and sweet and perfect, a first kiss that tasted of promise and possibility, and when they finally pulled apart, Lorraine was breathless and dizzy and more certain than ever that she had made the right choice. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation and building trust. Mrs. Henderson proved to be a kindly widow in her 50s who had known Isaac since he first came to Nebraska and was delighted to help him prepare for marriage. She taught Lorraine about the particular challenges of keeping house on the frontier, about preserving food and managing supplies, and dealing with the isolation that could be overwhelming for those not prepared for it. Isaac spent his days working the ranch, but he made time every evening to sit with Lorraine and talk, sharing stories about their pasts and dreams for their future. She learned that he had come west after losing both his parents to cholera, that he had worked as a ranch hand for 2 years before saving enough to file his own claim, that his dream was to build a cattle operation large enough to provide security for the family he hoped to have someday. In turn, she told him about growing up in Pennsylvania, about helping her mother with the younger children in their community, about her love of reading and her secret dream of maybe teaching school someday. Isaac surprised her by encouraging that dream, saying that Nebraska City was growing and would likely need a schoolteacher within a few years, that there was no reason she could not pursue that goal if she wanted to. The wedding was held on a Saturday afternoon in late June in the small church in Nebraska City, with Mrs. Henderson and a dozen of Isaac's neighbors as witnesses. Lorraine wore a simple dress that Mrs. Henderson had helped her make, with wildflowers in her hair, and when Isaac turned to watch her walk down the aisle, the look in his eyes made her feel like the most beautiful woman in the world. The reverend who married them was a circuit preacher named Wilson, a young man with an earnest face who spoke about the sanctity of marriage and the importance of building a life on faith and mutual respect. When he asked Isaac if he took Lorraine to be his wife, Isaac's voice was strong and clear as he said, "I do." And when Lorraine made her own vows, promising to love and honor this man through whatever challenges lay ahead, she meant every word with her whole heart. The kiss that sealed their marriage was slightly less chaste than the one they had shared in the cabin, and she heard Mrs. Henderson chuckle from her seat in the front pew. Then they were being congratulated by everyone present, and someone produced a fiddle, and someone else brought out food, and the celebration went on into the evening as the summer sun painted the sky gold and pink. When they finally returned to the ranch, now truly theirs together, Isaac lifted Lorraine over the threshold in the traditional way, both of them laughing. Mrs. Henderson had discreetly moved her belongings to a neighbor's house that morning, and the cabin was theirs alone for the first time. The laughter faded as they stood in the main room, suddenly shy despite all the time they had spent together over the past weeks. "Are you nervous?" Isaac asked softly, his hand still on her waist. "A little," Lorraine admitted. "Are you terrified?" he said with a rueful smile. "I keep thinking you are going to wake up tomorrow and realize you have made a terrible mistake." Lorraine reached up to cup his face, feeling the slight rasp of stubble under her palm. "The only thing I will realize tomorrow is that I am the luckiest woman in Nebraska," she said. "Now stop talking and kiss your wife." Isaac did not need to be told twice. Their first weeks of marriage were a revelation for both of them. Lorraine had known in theory what married life would entail, but the reality of sharing a bed with Isaac, of learning his body as he learned hers, of the intimacy and vulnerability and breathtaking joy of it all, was beyond anything she could have imagined. He was tender and patient, and the passion between them grew stronger with each passing day. But marriage was not just about the physical connection. It was also about learning to work together, to compromise, to support each other through the endless tasks that came with running a ranch. Lorraine threw herself into her new role with determination, learning to cook over the fireplace, to manage the chickens and the garden, to help with the horses when Isaac needed an extra pair of hands. It was exhausting work, harder than anything she had done back in Pennsylvania, but it was also deeply satisfying in a way she had never experienced before. Isaac proved to be everything he had promised and more. He was patient when she made mistakes, grateful for her efforts even when things did not turn out perfectly, and generous with both his time and his praise. He made her laugh with his dry sense of humor, challenged her to think differently about things she had always taken for granted, and held her close at night when the vastness of the prairie made her feel small and lonely. By late summer, Lorraine could not imagine her life any other way. She wrote long letters to her family, telling them about the ranch and her marriage and how happy she was. And she treasured the letters that came back from Oregon, full of news about their journey and their eventual arrival at their destination. Her father wrote that they had claimed good land near Salem, that he was pleased with the soil and the prospects, and that he was glad to know she was happy and well cared for. Her mother's letters were full of advice and love, and the occasional gentle reminder to be patient with the challenges of being a new wife. It was in October, with the prairie grass turning gold and the air taking on a crisp edge that hinted at the winter to come, that Lorraine realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but when she finally confided in Mrs. Henderson during one of the older woman's visits, Mrs. Henderson confirmed what she had already known in her heart. "How do I tell Isaac?" Lorraine asked, nervous and excited in equal measure. "However you want, dear," Mrs. Henderson said with a warm smile, "but do not wait too long. Men can be surprisingly oblivious about such things, but they deserve to know when they are going to be fathers." Lorraine decided to tell him that evening after dinner. They were sitting by the fire, Isaac reading while she mended one of his shirts, and she found herself watching him, this man who had become the center of her world in such a short time. He looked up, catching her stare, and raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" he asked. "Do I have something on my face?" "No," Lorraine said, setting down her mending. I have something to tell you, and I am not sure how you will react." Isaac immediately set his book aside, his expression becoming serious. "What is wrong?" "Nothing is wrong," she assured him quickly. "At least, I do not think it is wrong." "I hope it is not wrong." She took a breath, steadying herself. "Isaac, I am going to have a baby." For a moment he just stared at her, his expression frozen. Then his face broke into the biggest smile she had ever seen, and he was across the room in 2 strides, pulling her into his arms and spinning her around. "You are serious?" he asked, setting her down carefully as if she might break. "We are going to have a baby." "In the spring," Lorraine confirmed, laughing at his reaction. "Probably late April or early May." "A baby," Isaac repeated, and she could see tears in his eyes. "We are going to be parents." He pulled her close again, more gently this time, pressing his face into her hair. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for this, for everything, for choosing to stay with me." "You saved my life," Lorraine reminded him, her own tears flowing now. "It seems only fair that we create a new one together." The winter that followed was harsh, with heavy snows and temperatures that sometimes dropped so low that ice formed on the inside of the windows. But inside the cabin, Lorraine and Isaac built their own warmth, preparing for the arrival of their child and deepening the bond between them. Isaac proved to be adorably anxious about her pregnancy, constantly asking if she needed anything, if she was feeling all right, if she was doing too much. Lorraine found it endearing, even when she had to firmly tell him that she was not made of glass and could still do her normal work. As her belly grew, so did their excitement. They chose names together, debating the merits of various options late into the night. They prepared the cabin, building a cradle that Isaac crafted with his own hands, setting aside linens and small clothes. They talked about what kind of parents they wanted to be, what values they wanted to instill, what kind of life they wanted to give their child. When spring finally arrived, melting the snow and turning the prairie green again, Lorraine felt ready, though the fear was still there, lurking beneath her anticipation. She had heard stories about childbirth, about the dangers women faced, and though Mrs. Henderson had promised to be there to help when the time came. Lorraine could not completely suppress her anxiety. The labor began on an unseasonably warm day in late April, and it was long and difficult in the way that first labors often are. Mrs. Henderson proved her worth, calm and capable and full of encouragement, while Isaac paced outside like a caged animal, occasionally being allowed in to hold Lorraine's hand when the contractions got especially bad. Finally, after nearly 20 hours, their son was born, small and red-faced and screaming with impressive lungs. Isaac was allowed back in to meet his child, and Lorraine watched through her exhaustion as he held the baby for the first time, his hands looking enormous and rough against the tiny bundle, his expression one of pure awe. "He is perfect," Isaac said, his voice choked with emotion. "You are perfect." "Thank you, Lorraine. Thank you for our son." They named him Thomas Daniel Reynolds after both their fathers, and he became the new center of their universe. The first months were exhausting, filled with sleepless nights and constant demands, but they also contained moments of such pure joy that Lorraine sometimes felt her heart might burst with it. Watching Isaac with their son, seeing the gentleness and patience he showed, the way he would walk the floor at 2 in the morning singing off-key lullabies to soothe the baby's cries, made her fall in love with him all over again. As Thomas grew from infant to toddler, the ranch prospered. Isaac's herd increased, and he was able to hire a hand to help with the work, a young man named Jake who was reliable and hard-working. With the extra help, Isaac was able to spend more time with his family, and those were the moments Lorraine treasured most. The three of them together, working in the garden or taking walks across the prairie, or simply sitting on the porch watching the sunset. When Thomas was 2 years old, Lorraine found herself pregnant again, and this time a daughter was born, a tiny girl with her father's whiskey-colored eyes and her mother's dark hair. They named her Margaret Rose, after Lorraine's mother, and if Isaac had been devoted to Thomas, he was absolutely besotted with his daughter. Lorraine joked that the girl would be terribly spoiled, and Isaac did not even try to deny it. The years passed, marked by the changing seasons and the milestones of their children's lives. Thomas's first words, Margaret's first steps, birthdays and holidays and ordinary days that somehow became extraordinary because they were living them together. The ranch continued to grow, and Isaac was able to build the bigger house he had promised. A solid 2-story structure with proper bedrooms, and a real kitchen and windows that looked out over the land they had claimed and tamed together. Lorraine never did become a schoolteacher in the formal sense, but she did teach the children of their small community, holding lessons in her home during the winter months when the weather made travel difficult. Isaac supported her in this, proud of her dedication and the difference she made in the lives of the families around them. They received letters regularly from Oregon, full of news about Lorraine's family. Thomas and Margaret Summers were thriving on their new land, and Daniel had grown into a fine young man who was courting a girl from a neighboring farm. The distance between them was vast, but the connection remained strong, and they promised that someday, when travel became easier and safer, they would visit each other. 10 years after Isaac pulled Lorraine from the Missouri River, they stood together on their porch watching Thomas, now a sturdy boy of 9, teaching his 7-year-old sister how to ride one of the gentler horses. A third child, a son named Isaac Jr., played in the dirt at their feet, content with a collection of wooden blocks his father had carved. The sun was setting over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and Lorraine leaned into her husband's side, his arm coming around her automatically. "You ever regret it?" Isaac asked quietly. Staying here instead of going to Oregon with your family." Lorraine looked up at him, at the lines around his eyes that had not been there when they met, at the streaks of gray just beginning to show in his hair, at the face she had memorized and cherished every day for the past decade. "Not for a single moment," she said honestly. "You gave me a life I never knew I wanted, a home I never knew I was looking for. How could I regret that?" "I think about that day sometimes," Isaac admitted. "About how easily I could have missed you, could have been somewhere else when you needed help. About how my whole life would have been different if I had not heard those screams from the river." "But you did hear them," Lorraine reminded him. "You were exactly where you needed to be, exactly when you needed to be there. Maybe that is what fate is, just two people in the right place at the right time, brave enough to take a chance on each other." Isaac pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Then I am grateful for fate," he said. "And for currents and driftwood and broken ferry ropes and every other thing that conspired to bring you into my life." As the sun slipped below the horizon and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, their children's laughter rang out across the prairie, and Lorraine thought about how far she had come from that terrifying moment in the river. How much her life had changed because one man had been brave enough to ride into the current to save her. She thought about her parents in Oregon, building their own new life, and she knew they would be happy to know that she had found exactly what they had been searching for when they started their journey west. A fresh start, fertile ground for dreams to grow, and a future full of promise. The years continued to unfold with the steady rhythm of ranch life. Thomas grew into a young man who shared his father's love of the land and his mother's sharp mind, taking on more responsibility with the cattle and proving himself to be a natural leader. Margaret developed a passion for horses that rivaled her father's, spending hours in the barn caring for the animals and learning everything she could about breeding and training. Little Isaac, who insisted on being called just Ike as he got older, showed an aptitude for numbers and business that surprised everyone, keeping meticulous records of the ranch's expenses and income even as a young boy. When Thomas was 15, word came that Lorraine's parents would be making the journey from Oregon to visit. The letter arrived in early spring, and the entire household erupted in excited preparation. It had been 14 years since Lorraine had seen her family, and though they had maintained correspondence faithfully, she ached to embrace her mother and father again, to introduce them properly to her husband and children, to show them the life she had built in Nebraska. They arrived in late June, traveling with a group for safety, and Lorraine saw them coming across the prairie from miles away. She stood on the porch, one hand shading her eyes against the sun, and when the wagon finally pulled up in front of the house, she was running before she consciously decided to move, throwing herself into her mother's arms as soon as Margaret stepped down. The reunion was full of tears and laughter, of exclamations about how much everyone had changed, of introductions and stories, and the simple joy of being together again. Thomas Summers, now in his 60s with silver hair but still strong and vital, shook Isaac's hand and pulled him into an embrace, thanking him again for taking such good care of his daughter. Margaret could not stop touching Lorraine's face, marveling at how mature and confident she had become, at the grace with which she managed her household and family. Daniel had come too, now a married man himself with a baby daughter. He and young Thomas hit it off immediately, the 15-year-old fascinated by his uncle's stories of Oregon and farming on the western edge of the frontier. The two families spent 3 wonderful weeks together, catching up on lost time, sharing meals and memories and creating new bonds. On the last night before they had to leave, after the children were in bed and the adults were sitting on the porch in the cool evening air, Thomas Summers raised his cup in a toast. "To Lorraine and Isaac," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "When I gave my permission for my daughter to stay in Nebraska all those years ago, I was terrified I was making a terrible mistake. But seeing you now, seeing the life you have built, the family you have raised, I know it was the right decision. You have given my daughter everything I ever wanted for her, Isaac, and more than I could have hoped. Thank you for that." Isaac reached for Lorraine's hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "I am the one who should be thanking you," he said, "for trusting me with your most precious gift, for giving us your blessing even when it seemed insane, for raising a daughter strong enough and brave enough to take a chance on a stranger. I have spent every day since trying to be worthy of that trust." "You are more than worthy," Thomas assured him. "You are the best thing that could have happened to her." The next morning, saying goodbye was just as hard as it had been the first time, but there was less finality to it now. They promised to write more often, to visit again when they could. And as the wagon rolled away toward Oregon, Lorraine stood with Isaac's arm around her, her children clustered around them, and watched her parents disappear over the horizon once more. "You all right?" Isaac asked softly. "I am," Lorraine said, and she meant it. "I will miss them, but I am exactly where I am supposed to be." More years passed, each one adding its own chapters to their story. Thomas married at 20, a sweet girl named Sarah from Nebraska City, who fit into their family as if she had always been there. And they built a cabin on the far edge of Isaac and Lorraine's property, expanding the ranch and creating the beginning of what would eventually become a small family compound. Margaret, true to form, married a horse trader at 22, a charming man named David who appreciated her skill and independence and was happy to join the family operation. Ike surprised everyone by announcing that he wanted to go to college in the East to study law. Isaac and Lorraine scraped together the money to send him, proud and sad in equal measure, and he returned 4 years later with a degree and a determination to set up practice in Nebraska City, which had grown into a proper town with a courthouse and a need for good lawyers. Grandchildren arrived, first Thomas and Sarah's son, then twins from Margaret and David, then more from all 3 of their children as the years went by. The house that had once held just Isaac and Lorraine expanded to accommodate Sunday dinners with 3 generations gathered around the table, the rooms filled with noise and laughter, and the comfortable chaos of a large family. Isaac's hair turned fully silver, and the years of hard work left their mark on his body, aches in his joints and a weariness that came at the end of long days. But his eyes still lit up whenever Lorraine walked into a room, and his hand still reached for hers at night when they settled into bed, the gesture as automatic and necessary as breathing. Lorraine's dark hair developed streaks of white, and the lines on her face deepened, a map of every smile and worry and joy she had experienced. But she moved through her life with the confidence of a woman who knew exactly who she was and what mattered. And when she looked at the family gathered around her dinner table, at the ranch that spread out around their home, at the husband who still looked at her like she was the most precious thing in his world, she felt nothing but gratitude. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children organized a celebration, inviting the entire community to the ranch for a party. It seemed like half of Nebraska City showed up, along with friends and neighbors from miles around, all coming to honor the couple who had become pillars of their community. There were speeches and toasts, music and dancing, and more food than anyone could possibly eat. As the sun set and the party continued, Isaac pulled Lorraine away from the crowd, leading her down to the river that ran through their property. the same river system where they had met all those years ago. They stood on the bank, hand in hand, watching the water flow past, and Lorraine thought about the frightened young woman who had clung to Driftwood in this water, certain she was going to die. "What are you thinking about?" Isaac asked, his voice still carrying the warmth that had attracted her from the very beginning. "About how far we have come," Lorraine said. "About how one moment changed everything. About how grateful I am that you were there that day." "I would do it again in a heartbeat," Isaac said. "Dive into 100 rivers if it meant having you in my life." Lorraine turned to face him, reaching up to cup his weathered face in her hands. "I love you, Isaac Reynolds. I have loved you since that first day when you pulled me onto your horse, and I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "And I love you, Lorraine Reynolds," he replied, leaning down to kiss her with the same tenderness he had shown on their wedding day. "You are my heart, my home, my everything." They stood there as the stars came out overhead, the sounds of the party drifting down to them, and Lorraine thought about the life they had built from that single moment of courage and connection. She thought about their children and grandchildren, about the land they had tamed and the legacy they would leave behind, about 30 years of love and laughter, and the kind of partnership that most people only dreamed of finding. The years after that anniversary continued to be full, though the pace of life slowed somewhat as they aged. Isaac finally handed over the day-to-day management of the ranch to Thomas, content to advise and consult, but no longer carrying the weight of every decision. Lorraine continued her teaching, now working with her grandchildren and great-nieces and nephews, passing on not just knowledge but the values and stories that defined their family. They lost friends to illness and age, said goodbye to members of their community who had been there since the beginning, and mourned each loss while celebrating the lives that had been lived. They also gained new neighbors, new families arriving to settle the land that was still opening up to those brave enough to claim it, and they welcomed them as they had once been welcomed, offering advice and support and the benefit of their long experience. When they had been married for 40 years, Lorraine received word that her mother had passed away peacefully in Oregon, surrounded by her family. The grief was sharp despite the distance and the years, and Isaac held her while she cried, offering the comfort of his presence and his understanding. They could not make the journey to Oregon at their age, but they held a memorial service at their own church, celebrating Margaret Summers' life and the legacy she had left in her daughter and grandchildren. Thomas Summers followed his wife 2 years later, and Daniel wrote that their father had simply seemed to lose interest in living without his beloved Margaret by his side. Lorraine grieved again, but she also understood, because she could not imagine wanting to continue in a world without Isaac, could not picture days that did not include his presence and his love. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary, surrounded by what seemed like an impossible number of descendants. 3 children, 9 grandchildren, and the beginnings of a great-grandchild generation filled the house and spilled out onto the property. And Isaac joked that he had lost count of how many people shared his blood, but carried his name and legacy into the future. "We did well," he told Lorraine that night when they were finally alone in their room, exhausted but happy. "Look at what we built from one moment of blind faith and courage." "You did well," Lorraine corrected. "You took a chance on a half-drowned girl who had nothing to offer but her heart, and you built all of this." "We built it together," Isaac insisted, pulling her close. "Every bit of it together. That is what marriage is supposed to be." As they moved into their 70s, their health began to decline in the way that is inevitable with age. Isaac's joints bothered him constantly now, and he moved with the careful slowness of a man whose body no longer obeyed his commands the way it once had. Lorraine's eyesight failed, requiring her to wear spectacles for everything, and she tired more easily, needing afternoon naps that she had once scorned as weakness. But they faced each challenge together, supporting each other through every difficulty, celebrating every small victory, and refusing to let age diminish the love that had sustained them for more than 5 decades. Their children and grandchildren watched over them carefully, making sure they had everything they needed, but respecting their fierce independence and their determination to remain in their own home for as long as possible. It was late one autumn evening, with the first frost of the season threatening and the fire crackling in the hearth, that Isaac had a stroke. Lorraine found him collapsed in the barn, and her screams brought Thomas and his sons running. They carried him back to the house, and the doctor was summoned, but everyone knew the prognosis was not good. Isaac lingered for 3 days, drifting in and out of consciousness, and Lorraine never left his side. She held his hand, talked to him about their life together, reminded him of all the moments they had shared, all the love they had built. Their children came to say goodbye, bringing the grandchildren to see him one last time, and Isaac seemed to rally slightly for each visit, determined to hold on long enough to see them all. On the 3rd night, when it was just the 2 of them again, Isaac's eyes opened with unusual clarity. "Lorraine," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I am here," she assured him, leaning close. "I am right here, my love. Thank you," he said, each word obviously an effort, "for saying yes, for staying, for everything." "Thank you for saving me," Lorraine replied, tears streaming down her face. "For giving me this life, this family, this love. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." Isaac managed a small smile. "Love you, always." "Always," Lorraine echoed, and she was holding his hand when he took his last breath, his eyes closing peacefully as if he were simply going to sleep. The grief was overwhelming, a physical pain that made it hard to breathe, and for weeks after the funeral, Lorraine moved through her days like a ghost, unable to fully accept that Isaac was truly gone. Her children worried about her, staying close and trying to support her, but they all knew that losing Isaac had taken something fundamental from their mother, a piece of her soul that could never be replaced. But as the months passed and the initial sharp edge of grief began to dull into a persistent ache, Lorraine found ways to continue. She spent time with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, passing on stories about Isaac and ensuring that his memory would live on in the generations to come. She worked in the garden that Isaac had helped her plant 50 years ago, finding comfort in the familiar rhythms of growth and harvest. She sat on the porch in the evenings, looking out over the land they had claimed together, and talked to him as if he were still beside her. 3 years after Isaac's death, on a warm June morning very much like the one when they had first met, Lorraine passed away peacefully in her sleep. Her children found her with a smile on her face, and they liked to imagine that she had been reunited with Isaac, that wherever they were now, they were together again. They buried her beside Isaac in the family plot on the ranch, under a spreading oak tree that provided shade in summer and shelter in winter. The headstone reads simply, "Lorraine Reynolds, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother." She was clinging to Driftwood in the river, and he rode in and pulled her onto his horse. Together they built a legacy of love. The ranch continued under the management of their descendants, growing and changing with the times but never losing the foundation that Isaac and Lorraine had established. Their story became family legend, told and retold to each new generation, a reminder of the power of courage and love and the willingness to take a chance on the unexpected. Years later, one of their great-great-granddaughters, a writer from back east who was researching family history, stood at their graves and thought about the lives they had lived. She thought about a young woman fighting for her life in a river, about a cowboy brave enough to risk his own life for a stranger, about a love that had lasted more than 50 years and created ripples that were still spreading outward, touching lives that Isaac and Lorraine would never meet, but had nevertheless shaped. She pulled out her notebook and began to write, wanting to capture their story, to preserve it not just for the family but for anyone who needed to be reminded that sometimes the most important moments in life are the ones we never see coming, that love can bloom in the most unexpected circumstances, and that true courage is not the absence of fear but the willingness to act despite it. As she wrote, the wind whispered through the oak tree overhead, and if she had believed in such things, she might have thought it carried the echo of two voices, still together, still in love, still grateful for that one moment on the Missouri River when their paths crossed and their story began. The ranch prospered for generations after, a testament to the foundation Isaac and Lorraine had built through hard work, determination, and unwavering love for each other. Their descendants spread across Nebraska and beyond, carrying with them the values and lessons that had been passed down through the family. And each one knew the story of how it all began, with a river and a cowboy and a woman who was brave enough to say yes to an impossible love. And somewhere, in the vast prairie sky that stretched endlessly overhead, in the whisper of wind through the grass, in the flow of the river that had brought them together, the spirit of their love continued, eternal and unbreakable, a reminder that some stories are so powerful they never truly end. They just become part of the landscape, woven into the very fabric of the land and the people who call it home.